Yep.
Okay, great.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. It's 2 o'clock now, and I see that we have most of the team, if not everybody. So we're going to get started because we have a busy discussion for today where we're going to be going over some of the responses we received in terms of the scenario theme proposals. So just to level set where we are today, after our presentation last time, where we went in great detail into um, the matrix for the scenario one, so everyone understood what scenario one was, but also the types of scenario assumptions that are likely to change or are open for change in scenarios two and three. We had given folks a chance to think through that, maybe give another look at the scenario inputs and think through what the most important assumptions and themes for future scenarios were in their minds, and to submit that to us for review in this meeting as the way to kind of kick off the development of scenarios two and three. That was a very successful process, I would say. We got a lot of great input from the EPAC, a lot of good proposals for what scenarios and themes people are looking forward to potentially testing in scenarios two and three. And just to remind folks, this scenario building process is really starting with the EPAC at the moment. We're going to be talking through these themes, trying to create 2 additional scenarios on top of the scenario 1 that we've already gone through that really bound the CGPP assessment. We really want to have 3 scenarios that work together to provide a glimpse of what that the future worlds in New York State could really look like from a generation and transmission perspective, so that we can get a full sense of what those no regrets, minimum, maximum types of transmission development needs might be over the next 10 to 15 years and even to 2040. So with that in mind, we had gone over scenario one last time, trying to show what that initial case looked like, and asked folks to keep that in mind and think through what assumptions should be changed to test alternative futures to make sure we're not missing something that could have a really important impact on the placement of generation or the quantity or type of transmission upgrades that could be required to hit our state policy targets. And so with that kind of as the high level framing for the day, I was going to jump right into reading through some of the scenario proposals. I'm not going to read, who submitted them and every detail of the scenario proposals, but I was going to read the scenario theme and the purpose for the scenario and go through them, so people can hear, what was submitted, and it'll get clear, I think, what some of the most popular submissions were. And then I'll switch to kind of some statistics that I put together for the quantity of proposals and the number of people supporting individual scenario themes based on their submissions. But before I jump into that, I wanted to see if there's any quick questions before we dive into the content today. Okay, great. So with that, I'm going to jump into just reading through for everybody the submissions that we had received. I'm going to read the theme of the proposal and then the purpose that was submitted as the reason why we would want to do a scenario based off of that theme. This isn't going to take too awful long. I want to leave a little time for discussion. We received 19 different theme proposals from 9 separate entities, so a lot of good participation from the EPAC. And I want to switch now and just start at the top and read some of the themes and purposes. So the first one we received was a theme to test creating renewable energy zones in New York, and that would be to test a Texas or MISO method of creating dedicated transmission zones for renewable energy in the state in high renewable energy territories. So that's kind of testing, preemptively testing, building out high transmission capacity areas to help with deliverability of renewables. So that was the first proposal. Next is a proposal to minimize the need for DFERs, the zero carbon dispatchable resources or dispatchable emission-free resources, depending on what study we're talking about. So minimizing the need for those DFERs, and that would be to gauge alternate build-outs of the system without having to rely on this kind of fuzzier technology in the modeling. Number 3 was looking at a low or no alternative fuel slash DFER world to remove the need for DFERs to test a more localized and just transition, prioritizing decentralized load and avoiding the need to use these uncertain technologies.
Skylar, what's the difference between 2 and 3? I'm sorry.
Just the terminology that was used.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thanks. Sorry.
Yep, just DFERs versus alternative fuels. Yep.
Skylar, this is Radha Surya representing IPNI from Invenergy. Are you sharing your screen?
No, I'm just reading through some of the high-level proposals that were sent. I will share my screen when I go to a quick summary of the statistics, but I was not planning on sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you.
Skylar, Bill Acker, New York Best. Just it's not completely clear to me what the model's doing to minimize the need for DFERs. Is there a couple more sentences of texture on that?
Not at the moment. I
Okay.
think that a couple of these proposals did provide some assumptions that could be changed to enable that, which would be either to raise the cost of choosing hydrogen or DFERs, lower the availability of retrofits in terms of megawatts or something, or put a cap or remove it from the model entirely. But there's a lot of ways that could be done, and that actually sparked something in my memory. Bill, thanks. This discussion is just to give everybody a sense of the possible worlds people are envisioning, to give everyone a sense, just a quick baptism in what people were thinking. We can talk in more detail about the specific, most popular themes right after this. This is just kind of to seed the thoughts, and I don't really think we're necessarily going to need to get into the specific, what does the new assumption have to be today. I do think we should talk through, what worlds we're trying to create here. What two additional worlds are we creating that work with that first scenario to create a nice bounding scenario, a nice set of bounded scenarios. And it'll be important to talk about whether or what assumptions would probably need to be changed to create that. But it's not going to be important today yet to get into like what data do we need to use for that assumption, or what sources are we going to look for. That'll be for future meetings. But just the themes and the types of assumptions that should be investigated is mainly what we're going to jump into here after we've kind of gone through some of these high level scenario theme proposals. All right. So just going to jump back in here, going through some of these proposals. There was another proposal to increase the AC connections, the capacity of our AC transmission connections with our neighbors, essentially adding capacity between our control area and external control areas to see how the capacity expansion would change with increased import-export flows. There was a proposal to relax the policy resource requirements to test the model's preferred method to hit the decarbonization targets without explicit CLCPA targets of, say, 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind or 6,000 megawatts of storage. There's a proposal to accelerate electrification, doing a high load scenario that kind of minimizes energy efficiency and DER participation to test kind of that high boundary scenario of transmission needs. There's a proposal to do the opposite and basically focus on local resources and flexibility and energy efficiency to test a scenario that minimizes the expected need of high voltage and transmission level investments by focusing on a local electric economy. There's a proposal to use maximized time shifting with storage and flexible resources, and that would reduce transmission investments through augmenting the load profile. There was a proposal to do a very low demand forecast, energy demand forecast, to help bookend the load forecasts and the load differences to test different generation needs and transmission investments. There was a proposal to reduce or change the capital costs for generators to see how sensitive the model is for costs of different resources. There's a proposal to test the cap and invest program prices by adding a higher carbon price into the emissions price assumptions in the model to see what may happen in a future with a cap and invest program. There's a proposal to test a very low hydro output and retiring nuclear power at the end of life to test what additional replacements might be needed if, for example, in climate change, there is reduced hydro output and nuclear power does get retired at the end of their current permitted lifetimes. There's another one here to change the policy mandates again, just to consider maybe a 50 by 30 instead of 70 by 30, and then 85 or 95% by 40, just to show the scale of change required for those last few percentages on the way to 100% by 40. There's a proposal to remove all firm builds in the early years. That would mean removing the awarded and contracted renewable energy generators from the model instead of hard coding them in to show what the model might choose as incremental builds without reference to the currently awarded generators. And we have about 4 more here coming up. There's a proposal to do a very high load and low flexibility load forecast to gauge the alternate generation and transmission needs in a high demand or high electrification scenario. Another proposal for testing out the higher carbon price to test what would happen under a potential cap and invest program. Another proposal for a local resource focus with high DER, high local energy, energy storage, energy efficiency, and load flexibility to test the impact of local decentralized resources on the transmission and generation build out. And then the final proposal was to test a variety of scenarios and sensitivities on reducing impedance on transmission lines to see how that impacts the transmission build out. So as you can see, we got 19 different proposals here. A lot of them sound similar. You know, a lot of folks focused in on some of the kind of key test cases and sensitivities that a model typically has in these types of generation and transmission buildouts. I think we heard multiple times about changing the availability of the zero carbon resources, the DFRs, trying to focus more on load flexibility or high load or low load forecasts, with load forecasts being such an important opportunity and sensitivity in the models. So with that, just having run through those very, very quickly, I wanted to just share my screen really quick just to show the brief breakdown in the top themes that we saw from those proposals. I just ran through them, but it might be easier for folks to see. Okay, can you see the scenario proposal summary Excel sheet?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So just going through that list and the terms that folks were using, as I said before, there were 19 submissions from 9 unique entities. The most common theme that was listed in the scenario proposals was trying to lower or eliminate the availability of the model to choose DFRs. That's the common NISO term. I also counted anything that said the hydrogen resource in the model, because in our discussion of scenario 1, you'll probably remember that the state scenario uses the term like thermal combustion of hydrogen. So any proposals that asked to remove or lower the availability of that resource were counted here. So 5 of the 9 entities suggested that as one of the key scenario themes to be tested in one of the alternate scenarios. The next 2 are very similar, and they all relate to basically the load forecast that this zonal capacity expansion model will be operating under. There were three out of 9 entities each were requesting low load forecasts or very high flexibility forecasts to basically rely on the ability of either new tariffs or new load flexibilities or new technologies to shift load away from peak hours to minimize that type of transmission build out and see what that does to the generation build out and the transmission needs. And then a very related scenario is this third one here with the focus on local resources and a very high DER or decentralized system build out. Key terms that often popped up in those proposals were increasing distributed storage or maximizing energy efficiency or maximizing load responsiveness or demand response programs. And I think this is really coming from the sense of when folks are looking at lower bounding the transmission needs and transmission buildouts or creating these alternate worlds, really avoiding very high voltage interconnections of generation will tend to reduce the amount of transmission needs to interconnect those resources and deliver those resources. So it seems like folks were trying to focus on that high flexibility and high DER type proposals as the way to kind of minimize the bounds for those transmission buildouts. You probably noticed there was 2 separate proposals to look at a cap and invest program. This is an interesting thing to talk about that we'll come back to later because the cap and invest program, it seems, would be primarily themed around adding a higher carbon price to the emissions compliance prices that are in the model. That's a single assumption. There's like a single parameter in the model. So we'll have to circle back on that one specifically because that may be an opportunity for discussing sensitivities around that type of a carbon price proposal. But we'll see what type of interest there is in that and what type of capabilities we may have in that capacity expansion model to explore something like that. And then on the other side of things, moving away from the central scenario or the minimum transmission build out scenario, there were 2 different proposals that really focused on upper bounding that generation and transmission build out. They were exploring potential futures where there was very high electrification, lower flexibility than you may have expected, or lower distribution demand response, or whatever it may be, that would lead to higher peaks, higher total energy uses, and trying to figure out if that is the alternate future, what would happen in terms of the need for generation across the state, and thereby the transmission build out to enable the meeting of those higher energy needs with more generation. So that's kind of setting a couple of proposals to set kind of an upper bound here. And then finally, the one I want to talk through briefly and just give my perspective on before we jump into the conversation around a few of these. The last one here was you heard 2 proposers proposed various changes to state policy, either removing the CLCPA resource requirements or loosening the model's constraint on the emissions requirements of 70% renewables or 100% clean electricity by 2040. We're going to probably take those off the table at this point because this process that we're going through as part of the EPAC, through the CGBP, as that is written out in the order. This is a process to evaluate the generation and transmission needs to hit these targets. So this is not currently the time to run tests about not hitting the targets at the moment. That's for potentially future cycles if we ever needed to. But at this moment, this is not kind of relevant to our current needs in this scenario, and we'll be leaving any changes to state policy kind of out of the discussions at this point. I understand why people are saying this and where they're coming from, just to test alternate futures. But the goal here is to find 3 possible scenarios that hit our state targets, that bound the generation and transmission build-outs that we might see, so we can give the commission the best available information about what it might cost and what types of projects will be needed to build out that system of the future. So changing state policy as one of the inputs kind of defeats that purpose. So we're going to be leaving that off the table. So I'm just going to say that right now. This last one is probably out. So with that, I wanted to switch over the discussion and use the rest of the day today to kind of walk through these these main themes that got the highest amount of votes, and see what people thought, and just some questions to guide the discussion were really, why do you think this is a valuable theme? Why is it important? How does it really blend well with the first and potentially third scenario to create an alternate world? What are the transmission impacts you think of doing this? And then alternatively, why do you not want to see this type of theme arise in a scenario? So I was going to ask folks to raise their hand. And Jalila, would you be able to manage the hands? Since I'm sharing my screen, I can't actually see hands again for some reason. So if you'd be able to track the hands and call on people, that would be excellent if that's possible.
Sure. I know Erin Hogan has her hand up right now, and then you've got 3 others behind her.
Okay, great.
Skylar, I'm not sure I agree with this consideration regarding the last 2 scenarios that were proposed, but leaving that aside, I think one foundational consideration that we should understand prior to getting into all these scenarios is we have a total of 3 scenarios, albeit a scenario that DPS and NYSERDA came up with. We are given 2 scenarios. How many sensitivities do we have? Because the so-called top 3 votes, really top 3 proposals, are somewhat, could end up in similar outcomes with just a little bit of load consideration. And so, in other words, they could be proxy, and it kind of depends on how many sensitivities we might have, and that can help inform how we weigh and perhaps model these options.
That is a great observation and a really great point. The ability to test some of these things, and I mentioned that on the Cap and Invest, where it's one specific assumption that may be able to kind of link to one or all of the scenarios as a sensitivity. So the availability of sensitivities is also kind of key here to figure out how many worlds, quote unquote, we could test. We don't have a fixed number that we've gotten, from the NYSO who's running the capacity expansion model. We don't have like a number of sensitivities that can be run on each of the 3 scenarios yet. We do have, and this is something I actually asked last week in one of the meetings, was trying to figure out what's the type of workload that's going to be available to kind of test some of these things. And it's really hard to kind of pin that down because each one of the different sensitivities may be more effort. It might just be one assumption changing, but that assumption may impact the modeling run. It's a lot more, or maybe a lot harder to change. And so there is likely the ability to run sensitivities on one or all of these scenarios, but we don't know how many yet.
Okay, and for the purposes of today's discussion, it probably won't matter, but at some point as we're going down this path, I hope we can start getting that feedback sooner rather than later, because we're having biweekly meetings that are basically scheduled through the end of December, and I would hate to be rushed in making a decision without having that key data point. I do have one other foundational question that I think it will be important before we go too far into these top three. The question, from my recollection in the system resource outlook, they did Plexos run and then put the output into MAPS, and MAPS didn't solve. And is there somebody from the NISO who could verify that for me and confirm my understanding? And I don't know if Yachi is on the phone or if there's somebody else. The reason why, and the reason why I'm asking it is I think it was an interesting, and well, let me pause. Is there somebody from the ISO who's on that could remind me of the last Outlook study?
I don't know that we have, it's Liz. I don't know that we have anybody from NISO today.
Okay. And in this study, though, let me just make sure I understand the process too. We're going to have the Plexos runs with generation build schedule. The utilities will place those generators where they think is a reasonable location based on queue numbers and perhaps some other judgment calls. And it's under those conditions that they start trying to, do they run maps at all before they start trying to build out the transmission?
I think the production cost modeling is saved for stage 5. I don't think we're running any here in stage 1.
Okay, okay.
Well, sorry,
right,
one caveat is that the NISO does it through their system resource outlook for all scenarios. So we might have production cost outputs for the scenario 1.
Okay, got it. All right, so then we don't have to worry about maps not solving. All right, I just wanted to confirm that. So thank you.
Thank you.
And it looks like we have Raya next, and then there are 3 others after Raya.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I also joined just about 5 minutes late, so if it's possible I've missed something. But the CLCPA is very clear that the Commission's work in this area should create substantial benefit to disadvantaged communities. I think that requires this exercise, including in scenario 1, to include that as a policy goal, and that be a policy goal throughout all scenarios as sort of a unitary foundational, goal. So my question is, is this benefit to disadvantaged communities as one of the policy goals for scenario 1? If not, I think it should be. But how is benefit to disadvantaged communities represented in scenario 1? And then, yes, just advocating that we need to ensure that it's the equity and justice mandates of the CLCPA must be represented in all of the scenarios. I don't see it here, so I want to make sure it's inserted as a top theme.
Sure. So the scenarios that were designed, for example, through the integration analysis as part of the Climate Action Council scoping plan, were kind of designed from the ground up to be compliant with the CLCPA targets and the policy itself of providing benefits to disadvantaged communities. We're, at least in the first scenario, we're relying on that load forecast to build that out and hitting all the targets of the CLCPA. Did you have like a specific component about the DAC benefits that you were hoping to kind of provide as a target for the assumptions, or is there something specific you think we're missing, like with something to do with carbon or a specific technology target?
Well, so answer's yes in that you know, I certainly, and I know that one document that was sent out about assumptions was a high-level document, but certainly the benefit to disadvantaged communities must be or should be added as one of the policy goals, as that's very clear in the CLCPA. So sort of just asking that we make sure that you know, as the CLCPA is very prescriptive, that we make sure to include that in the policy goals when we are looking at scenario one and all the scenarios. But then, yes, it's really that question which you started to answer is, you know, how are these benefits to disadvantaged communities, you know, currently baked into your modeling, or how are you representing that? And I could see a lot of dimensions of that, right? Like we're tracking, there's a spatial dimension to the actual identified disadvantaged communities. I know we're tracking it from an IRA perspective, so I guess the question is really and I absolutely have suggestions in terms of what I would like to see, for alternative scenarios to capture benefit to disadvantaged communities and the other goals. But how exactly what you started to answer, how are you thinking about it, and how is it represented in scenario one, and how you're thinking about it going forward?
Right.
That could be a broader question, but it's just I can see that being an issue like on a number of different aspects, including what's baked into the integration analysis.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. This effort right now to come up with these assumptions for this capacity expansion model is a little bit limited in terms of the ability to answer, how granularly are we tracking these benefits to specific disadvantaged communities, because the model is a zonal model. And a lot of the tracking of benefits occurs through program development, the actual policy programs that are implemented to, say, fund resource development or fund flexibility or energy resources or emissions reductions. Those more granular decisions are typically made in the program development phase, which would be coming out of this. If we figure out zonal, general zonal locations and transmission buildouts, then we would zoom in on the more nodal aspects of these things that are more likely to come up in stages 2 through 4. So I'm not sure I'm going to have a fully, baked answer right now about how specifically the capacity expansion model is going to do A versus B for individual zip codes or neighborhoods, because we are only looking at a zonal level, which often has multiple counties in it. But we are trying to be, at least in the stage 1, we're still trying to be completely consistent with the CLCPA. And then as we get more granular in the modeling, we'll get more granular with the compliance methods.
But is it, at least, and you're correct, there are entire counties, but there's some, the disadvantaged communities are concentrated in specific areas. So we know, and look, it's the big, we know it's New York City, we know it's above New York City, it does cross counties, we know it's Buffalo, we know it's Albany. So is there at least a tracking geographically in these zones of where these DACs appear?
Right, we do have the state resources available to us to show us where those resources are, and I think the order even mentions this. Someone can check me on that, but I think the order also mentions that we have to be consistent with those as we go through the modeling all the way through stages 2 through 4, and then to the end proposals. We need to be consistent with the CLCPA guidance on DAC benefits.
All right, and I think, and maybe it merits a broader, more focused conversation on, because on exactly what is being done and how that, how that will play out as folks begin to propose, alternative scenarios that are trying to dig in on some of these issues that where disadvantaged communities and equity are implicated. So I guess that's putting a pin in. I think I would, it'd be great to have a deeper discussion. I know I'd like to have one, because I know we're looking to propose very specific scenarios that will implicate that. And 2 more things. One, is it fair to say that the benefit to disadvantaged communities is now included in the policy priorities of scenario 1 and will be included in the policy priorities of the subsequent scenarios as required by the CLCPA?
Yeah, all of our scenarios 1, 2, and 3, all 3 are going to be designed to be consistent with the goals of CLCPA, including the benefits to disadvantaged communities. Yes.
Okay, and it would be fantastic if in, say, documentations that include the policy goals, you know, that included, because the CLSP is very specific about these proceedings needing to provide substantive benefit, that those words are actually there. And so I would ask that that be the case, and hopefully it can be the case. And then my second question is that I see, you know, this popularity of, you know, of the most mentions here, 19 submissions from 9 entities. Is it fair to say, has there been some weighting? You know, it's not just if one group put in, you know, 5 and another group put only 1, you know, is there some consideration there in terms of what's most popular, and that one more would have come from one entity?
Yes, that's actually, I'm glad you raised that up, because my first way I was going to break it down was just number of mentions, but then that would kind of skew it towards anybody who may have put in more than one. And so right here, I actually brought it down by number of entities. So this is just like
Oh, okay,
how
you
many
did indeed.
individual entities. Yeah. So this is trying to weight it just for, you know, number of separate entities of the EPAC that submitted that.
Okay, and just can you confirm, can we ensure that substantive benefit is included in the policy language when we're talking about the policy goals for scenarios, including scenario 1?
It's Liz. Can I just jump in here for a second? I don't think we're writing any policy language. So I'm not quite sure how to answer.
I'm referring to the
Part of your
document that was
question.
sent out about the assumptions. It had a paragraph on the policy goals and it didn't include it. That's why I'm asking.
Okay, well, I think we should step back, and you might have missed this part of Skylar's intro.
I very well might have.
You know, the sort of from a very high level perspective, and I am not a technical expert or a modeler, but from a high level perspective, the purpose of establishing the 3 scenarios, as Skylar said, is to sort of construct 3 visions of what the world might look like that will help the commission understand where to invest ratepayer money. So we're looking for scenarios that kind of talk to each other and illuminate each other so that we can give the commission a better understanding and a better picture about, you know, what things are more likely to happen than others, so that the commission can make some long-term bets. You know, we're talking here about long-term bets on where to invest in transmission and where to support generation. So, and since we're doing this on a zonal level, I'm not sure that this particular planning exercise is going to generate, Skylar, you know this better than I do, but I'm not sure this particular planning exercise, this particular scenario development is going to provide the sort of program level information that, you know, ultimately has to be, you know, part of the pitch.
Yes, although that's not what I understood that answer about the program level, but that's not what I'm getting at. Like there are several things. So the commission is going to need guidance on this mandate of 35% investment benefiting disadvantaged communities with the goal of 40%. You know, that's a question that's going to need to be answered. So that's going to need to be tracked vis-a-vis disadvantaged communities in some regard in this modeling, as are some of the other very specific mandates with regards to environmental justice and disadvantaged communities. So that's what I'm getting at. And that's why I'm saying it's so important that we remember that there are very specific mandates for the CLCPA and very high, and we should always be remembering the high level policy objectives. And I understand that these are emerging, you know, these are emergent, you know, things that we're tracking, but they are the law, and we need to be, and I'm happy to be part of the solution. We need to be creative about how we're going to get there, but they are the law, so we do need to get there. So, all right, thank you. I will yield my time here. I'll yield the floor.
Thank you. That was great.
And next, it looks like we have a question from Rodica.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So I have maybe a comment on the scenario that reference renewable energy zones. Skylar, is it in what team is included here? The top teams, or is it included?
Oh, sorry. That was the I did not have on here anything that was only submitted by one entity. So that's if you remember, I think from the first 19 that I proposed, that's not showing up here. It's because it was only submitted by the one entity that submitted it, and there was not like additional support for that one. Doesn't mean we can't, discuss it. It was just, this is the summary of the ones that were listed by more than one entity.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So any scenario that was submitted only by one entity will not be shown here. Maybe for completeness, would be good to have everything, and you just put one, or I guess one. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
And I do have comments on that because for I guess for full disclosure, I've submitted it on behalf of AC New York. So the interest was in seeing a renewable energy zone scenario, given that this is a transmission planning process, and a mix of what infrastructure could be built to unlock the richest renewable areas would seem appropriate. This is a process to be coordinated with local utilities and New York ISO. So why not look at this type of scenario that looks at transmission comprehensively on both the bulk side and the local side. So that's the idea of that scenario. And to us is needed, especially that there are some assumptions made in the current model and in the first scenario about intra-zone constraints. And I understood from last time that utilities have proposed those headroom values and the marginal upgrade cost. And that was sent to New York ISO, but EPAC members have not seen that data. And to us, if we include intra-zone constraints, we may be limiting renewables because the transmission is limiting today, but the point of the process is to address some of those constraints and optimize the constraints to address. So at the minimum, my request would be to have to share the data of those headroom values so we can review what has been incorporated to date. And second, still discuss the benefit of essentially relaxing some of those intra-zone constraints and possibly the zone-to-zone constraints as well, because that could open up the consideration for a bulk solution as well. I don't know if you want to address it now or later.
I know. I'm trying to think through the exact response. I might need some other folks to weigh in on this, just to help me in my thinking. I'm kind of torn here because part of the process here is to identify the least cost build outs of generation and transmission. And so if we start by basically relaxing transmission constraints, we don't really learn anything about how to actually make that less expensive for ratepayers, unless we have like some really good information about how much it's going to cost to do the relaxing that we are starting with. We propose to use those types of headroom numbers so we could actually analyze this proactively, but with the concept that we could use as sensitivities, maybe relaxing interzonal constraints if something about the modeling results is showing us there could be really high value in relaxing some of those constraints. So I'm part of me is thinking, yeah, well, I mean, other zones are doing this type of thing where they're identifying places with high wind or high solar and just building out transmission proactively. But then looking back here and what we've set up so far through the CGPP is a process that starts, a couple steps before that, of trying to, most effectively use existing headroom and match the least cost transmission build outs to hit the targets, as opposed to preemptively building out those types of renewable energy zones. So I'm wondering if we're starting too late or the renewable energy zone ideas starting too early. I'm just interested to hear other folks' thoughts if you want to jump in.
Maybe just to respond to your response, Skylar. So we are now proposing to relax all the zones. We are first asking to see the headroom values that are being used currently or that will be used in the model, just to understand what the assumption is. And second, and I think I don't see why those values will not be allowed to be seen by EPAC members. Second, we are proposing to look at potentially relaxing those constraints if they are limiting to the limiting in the model for the renewable rich areas. That could be like Southern Tier, North Country, Watertown. We know that those areas have a lot of renewable potential and interest is seen in the queue as well. So it's not relaxing all constraints. We agree that that approach is not feasible, but we are saying for those particular areas that are known to be constraining today, relative to the interest and potential of those zones, that there should be a more a deeper look into what infrastructure is best, is like least expensive, that
Right.
at the same time unlocks a lot of renewables.
Okay. Yeah, I think I understand that. And so from your perspective, if we have, for example, the supply curve, which is what we're using as the basis for renewable availability, there might be places, like you said, the Southern Tier or the North Country or something that show high resource availability, and they may be limited by headroom constraints. But we also have kind of it looks like we're going to be using a marginal transmission upgrade constraint also, so that the model will be able to choose, if it sees really low cost, high resource potential in a certain area, the model can choose to build out a little bit more transmission to free up that. So we're giving this kind of a model, this kind of a choice, whether or not to build renewable energy zones. We're basically giving that choice to the model by showing it the full resource availability in these areas, which, as you would expect, some of these areas are going to have very high resource availability, but we're basically letting the model choose whether or not to build the zones. And I'm wondering what you think of that, if you think that's sufficient, or if you think we should, if there's something else we would learn by, increasing headroom numbers up front instead.
So first of all, I think we need to see the data before we can provide a response, because we don't know what that data is. Marginal upgrade cost, how is that defined, how that was built? Is it based on upgrading, rebuild, reconductoring? What is that based off, or building a new line? So it's I think we cannot respond until we
Got it.
see the
And that's
data, and maybe
understood.
if it's constraining, an approach could be simply, yes, do a sensitivity, assuming at least those areas with high supply potential from the PA analysis relaxed, just to test that as a sensitivity at a minimum. I think that should
Yes.
be done.
I think you hit it right on the head right there. I think this does feel like something important to analyze, one way or another, whether it's something that'll fall out of our first scenario, or whether relaxing constraints are a sensitivity. I think this could be something to look at as a sensitivity, but we will be sharing that information. It was just locked down on Friday, what numbers will actually be used. And so as a follow-up, I'm going to ask whoever from the JU might be here taking notes, if we can send the headroom numbers and the marginal cost of transmission number out within the next week, hopefully, so people have a chance to review it before the next meeting, if those numbers are available to be sent. And I think someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're using the Climate Action Council scoping plans marginal cost of transmission upgrades, which is based off of the most recent utility transmission upgrade projects. And for the headroom numbers, I think we're using the utility's most recent August headroom filings. The underlying data that builds those, I'm not an expert in that at all, so I'll leave the utilities to kind of partially explain it, at least when they're sending the details over.
Thank you for confirming that that data will be shared.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Scalar, this is Radha. I know there are other hands, but I want to piggyback on Radhika's suggestion. Do you mind if I chime in?
Oh, no, if it's relevant, I don't mind.
Okay, yeah, on the marginal cost, when you are looking at this, you're looking at both the local transmission upgrades, lower kV and higher kV network bulk upgrades to come up with those marginal cost numbers. And how are you considering HVDC or others that might be needed for interjournal transfers, for to make sure these targets are met?
I'm going to go out on a limb here and then ask someone from the JU to kick me. But I think those marginal costs of transmission is marginal cost of local transmission. I think they're based off of the utility upgrades needed within their territories, within the zones. I don't think that refers to the interzonal costs.
Hey, Skylar, this is Jeff Marr from National Grid, and yes, that's correct.
Oh, okay. Whew. Did that answer your question, Radha?
Yeah, it does, but raises a bunch of other questions. But so we can discuss as we see these costs, and probably that's the time we might have to dive, dig deeper into this.
Yeah, it just raised for me, what might we want to do if the model does show us, as the order says, if the model shows us something that looks like it might be an interzonal constraint that might want to be relaxed, what do we, how do we do that? How do we implement it? Is there a cost we need to apply there? That type of thing. So definitely should have some more conversation on that when we get to that.
Yeah, because my assumption is that we are identifying not only local transmission, we are thinking about bulk upgrades as well. So there will be some within the zones too. So we need to have some kind of marginal cost added into the model for us to have that mitigation identified as part of the results.
Thanks for raising that. Yeah.
Skylar, this is John Berger with NYSERDA. Just to add something to that last point, I think it's important to keep in mind that in the order, there is a definition of how to handle those, looking at those bulk alternatives. Which, as Skylar mentioned earlier, is the potential for sensitivities that relax those interzonal constraints. But then for DPS, with the assistance of NYSERDA, to engage a consultant to look at costs and modeling for those bulk alternatives in the cases where those sensitivities are conducted. So I think to your question about how might those different technologies and costs be considered, it's through that process defined in the order, rather than these local headroom numbers that Jeff and others from the JU confirmed were being leveraged for the base scenario in the capacity expansion itself.
Thank you for that. Yep, that was very helpful.
Thank you, John.
Looks like Bill, you have your hand up next.
Oh, thank you, Julia. It's Bill Acker. Skylar, I've got a couple questions. One is around the process going forward. You've done a nice job of outlining the scenarios that have been suggested so far. And I'm wondering about if you could give us a little texture on how we flesh these out over the next little while. And what I'm particularly interested in is that for a number of these scenarios, the actual values that we end up choosing to model become exceptionally important. And in a lot of cases, the costs and the upgrade, the implication of traditional transmission build-outs will not be at all linear with some of the parameters we're modeling. So, for example, in the local scenarios, having more load flexibility and having more local distributed generation and local energy storage, there will very likely be thresholds where you don't have much benefit up to some point, and then suddenly you have a big jump in benefit. because you've eliminated the need to supply a lot of energy to that particular region. And that's likely to happen in some of the other scenarios as well. So there's a piece of doing some work to actually really fine tune these scenarios and find the precise levels that we want to put into the models. And then there's the other piece that Rado was bringing up earlier of just, are these scenarios really going to be compliant, and how? And I think of the low DFIR scenarios. What is going to replace the DFIR in those scenarios? Certainly, it's hopefully not gas power peaker plants. So is that super high load flexibility? Is it a lot of vehicle to grid? Is it a lot of other things? What are we actually going to put in there and test to make sure that we actually make the CLCPA goals and have a reliable electric grid with it? And that leads me to think that we very likely want to have some external modeling consulting capability to analyze these scenarios and work with this group over the next 2 months to finalize them. So I'm wondering, how are you viewing the process? Are you viewing the process that you will be bringing in external consultants to fine tune this and work with the group to really hone them? What are your thoughts on how we actually move forward from here?
Yes. Okay. So the process that I was trying to lay out over the last couple of meetings was basically that we're getting all this input up front, and we're trying to use today's meeting to get to 2 or 3 of these high-level themes that we think generate worlds in their own right, and what components of those worlds we're generating as scenario 2 and scenario 3 that could be their own scenarios. And then we're going to have the JU take those themes that we've all created and come up with and discussed, and bring back for the next meeting just very high level scenario matrices with the assumptions that would likely need to be changed to create a scenario like that highlighted, so that we can go through those matrices assumption by assumption, basically, just like we did with the scenario 1, but actually generating what those assumptions should probably be. If we needed additional support to come up with how we think those various assumptions will impact load or transmission build out or whatever, we're in discussions right now to figure out how that's going to how that might happen and who we might have available to support that. But the process after that was going to hopefully be to create, over the 3 following meetings, the 2 November meetings and the December meeting, generating what those assumptions would have to be, and utilizing either existing data sets from the NISO or the integration analysis, or generating new data sets to fill in those scenario matrices for scenarios 2 and 3 before handing them over to the NISO in January for the capacity expansion modeling. I do hear your point, though, about how we might not know exactly how these assumptions impact the capacity expansion model until we run the model. So it would be nice to know ahead of time somehow. I'm not sure we're going to have that luxury, unfortunately. This is really speaking to maybe the need to engage the EPAC again, even post-January, as part of stage 1, to make sure that the scenarios we've developed are coming out of the actual stage 1 capacity expansion modeling in the way we were hoping they would, and they're testing the things we wanted to test. And so, if we, the plan right now is to get as good information as we can as possible, using whatever resources we have available to us now until January, and then stay engaged through the capacity expansion modeling to make sure it's actually doing what we're hoping.
I say, yeah, I think it's going to be important to do that, Skylar. And I also, at least for the kind of what we dub the hyperlocal scenario, or the scenarios where you're really using the high flexibility and load shifting and DERs and local storage to dramatically reduce the amount of transmission build out you have to do. That is, as we talked about in previous meetings, that's not going to show up in the capacity expansion model. Because so we know a priority that if we just run the capacity expansion model, we're going to miss the entire concept. And so we really do need to be a little bit more thoughtful on how we actually achieve that particular one. I also suspect that there's a few other cases here, and I guess that really gets to my second question, which is, you know, I heard earlier in Aaron's questions about how many scenarios for the ISO, et cetera. You know, I suspect the ISO has limited bandwidth and other people have limited bandwidth. I also recognize that, you know, we are going to invest tens of billions of dollars, and a 10% difference in that is an incredible amount of money. So, you know, this is incredibly important. And I know you've got constraints on what we can do here as far as to do more modeling. I would, though, strongly urge us to think about expanding the amount of modeling we're going to do here, because, you know, spending a little bit more on modeling now to save $1 billion in this process, you know, makes a lot of sense.
I definitely hear that. I definitely hear that feedback. Thanks, Bill. And I think this is a discussion where if something that comes out of this meeting is that having high flexibility or high DER or high local focus as one of the key scenarios, that's something that the actual assumptions of how we implement that in stage 1 and flow through to stage 2, that could be a discussion of a meeting, either a whole meeting or a half a meeting at one of these November meetings where we're actually generating the scenario assumptions themselves. And I think this is a place where the JU could be very useful and very helpful in identifying, you know, how would this flow through? Because you're exactly right, Bill. Like, if we're hard coding 6,000 megawatts of storage into the model, either way, if it's a zonal model, the model doesn't care if it's at 230 kV or behind someone's meter in their house, right? So it's one of those things where we're going to have to find a way to have it implement in the way we want it to represent the reality of the future we're trying to build. And whether that's, you know, making changes to the load forecast or the dispatch signal of the model, of the storage in the model, or just changing the way things are cited in stages 2 through 4 when we're actually doing the nodal analysis. That's something we're going to need to discuss more granularly if this ends up being one of the top, you know, 2 next scenarios we want to do. I didn't want to get into things that deep today, but I definitely hear that, and it's definitely something we need to go through and maybe be able to see and hear from the JU on how that would happen, and then come together and discuss, you know, how to implement that as a scenario.
If I could add something, Bill, it's Liz. If I could just add, remember the scope of this process is the process the JU proposed and that was approved by the commission. So those are the kind of limits that the EPAC is working inside of, is to support the execution of the proposal that the JU presented and the commission approved.
And Bill, I just want to add, this is Tom Vaccaro from the JU, and planners and modelers on the phone. Keep me honest, because I'm a little at the tip of my skis. But that's a good challenge you identify from the technical standpoint, that the techno-economic optimization in the capacity expansion isn't really going to affect distribution, and there may be a blind spot there. I think the way that we had preliminarily envisioned distribution being considered without breaking the model was largely as an input, because the distribution side of planning has a pretty good grasp on pathways to their goals. So for example, we should be using the same forecasts as distribution when going through disaggregation in stages 2 and 3 of the capacity expansion model, and that those forecasts do envision at a state level achieving at least the DER targets that are currently set out as part of CLCPA. Flexible load is a little bit more of a challenge, given that my understanding is on the distribution policy side, there hasn't been a lot of headway, and we're sort of, like I said, treating distribution as an input. So where we see policy changes and other indications, we'll sort of feed those in. For example, cost share 2.0, if there were a bank that needed to be upsized as a result of that, that would be something we'd want to capture, at least in terms of the impacts to headroom. But not optimize around because the model doesn't have sort of that level of vision. So long way of saying that there may be a way to address your concern through one of the scenarios that we already have set out without setting out a different one if you're just looking to achieve the DER targets explicitly. And we're generally planning to rely on distribution, local feeder level and substation level forecasts in disaggregating those zonal DER targets to make sure that they are considered in CGPP without explicitly having them part of the capacity expansion model, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, and Tom, I think you certainly were interested in the DER targets. I think the what we wanted to test in this scenario, I think what a few other people wanted to test, seeing the 3 of them or 6 of them, depending on how you count the high flexibility and the high DER together or not, is the concept of actually reducing the bulk transmission build out via having a much higher local energy, so the generation and flexibility, and so that gets a little trickier to test in this modeling scheme we have. But we think it's important because we expect that it could have a substantial impact on the amount we have to build out. I also believe, though, and I don't want to focus this conversation solely on that scenario. I know a lot of people have other scenarios that are very good here as well, and I suspect that the kind of analysis that I'm pushing for here up front, is also appropriate for a number of the other scenarios in cases where there may be other things that may not fully play through from just the capacity expansion to the actual end solution, like higher amounts of bulk storage or storage transmission up there, or what was talked about for Mason, New York earlier of the the renewable zones, that there may be ways to play that through. So I do think it's going to be valuable to kind of do this preliminary work as we're developing the scenarios.
Thanks, Bill. And keep thinking about that and keep bringing it up so we don't drop that and we don't miss anything as we're trying to test these things. So that will be very important in terms of driving potential higher voltage investments versus avoiding them. Are there more hands?
Yeah, it looks like we've got Dave Rupert next, and then we've got 2 others after him.
Yeah, thanks, Jalila. So Skylar, I was just trying to kind of ground myself to make sure that I'm not missing something here. But from a KISS method, just keeping it simple, the load is still down in the southeastern part of the state, correct?
Right now, or in our future load forecasts?
In the future load forecast, the vast amount is still in the southeast.
Well, it's kind of hard to answer that. There is a pretty dramatic build out of, depending on what you're counting as load, as for electrolysis in different scenarios or storage load in different scenarios, electrification in general and industry load, for example. So it's not quite as concentrated as you might think in some areas.
Okay, and it seems like we've still got offshore wind and northern part of the state as well as western New York for building out renewables. There won't be as many.
Yep.
Right.
That's where the land is. Land, yeah.
Yep, that's the projection. So to me, it seems like we still have to be talking about getting that power, distributed, but concentrated down toward at least the southeast or to some of the other areas. So I'm kind of going back on what Radhika was saying, that it seems like some things need to be relaxed in order to be able to figure out these larger transmission systems that need to be built, and they need to be more focused, not just having power going out throughout the entire system. So technologies are HVDC or low impedance. That was something that I'll admit that we went ahead and submitted. It just doesn't seem like the low impedance needs to be singled out, but could go with other scenarios as sensitivities in order to be more efficient in the transmission systems. So I'm advocating that it doesn't need to be singled out as an only scenario, but it should be reviewed by the ISO at a higher level to make sure that you're getting the optimal solutions rather than a fractured solution. This reminds me of what FERC said in the latest transmission ROFR, talking about moving things across zones rather than having everything done in suboptimal zones and not looking at the bigger picture.
Okay, so I take it it's your opinion that at least the base case method that we're using here in the first three scenarios of zonal build outs with headroom and potential upgrade constraints to build that out and have the generation recited and then figure out whether there are intra or interzonal upgrades needed to make the most optimal generation build out. That three-step process. Do you still think that's a good base case, and then we use as a counterfactual, as a sensitivity, releasing some of those constraints, or are you advocating for doing that proactively up front for all scenarios?
I think you could do it with a sensitivity rather than having it be up front. I just think that it needs to be analyzed in order to be optimal. Otherwise, it just feels like we're sub-optimizing.
And is that primarily because it's going to focus too much on alleviating constraints in the zone and then only through our own analysis figuring out whether we want to do interzonal issues, when it sounds like you think that's going to be a no-brainer in some cases that we might miss?
I think so. The alternative is to go ahead and do CREZ, more of a CREZ type scenario and start at the opposite end.
And sorry, what is that? I'm not familiar with that.
The competitive renewable energy zones.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah.
Where you're basically saying let's figure out where the my scenario of this, coming from a Texas solution, is that you figure out where can you actually site where are the optimal locations for the renewables. They're certainly not in the Adirondacks, right?
Right.
So,
right. Yeah.
So figure out where that ought to be and then build the transmission to bring it in. Now that's anathema for some places that may not want it, but the alternative is to continue to go through this flogging process for the next 5 years and still never meet 2030.
Got it. Definitely understand that. Yeah, that's definitely the concern, is trying to build the most cost-effective combination of transmission generation to hit the targets, and there's ways to do it. We've chosen, at least for the space case, the process of starting with the existing transmission system, those existing transmission constraints, the list of resources that are available across the state, and seeing how we can kind of build on that to try to get to the cheapest system. But it obviously sounds faster to just find the areas with the highest quantity of renewables, or highest lowest cost, highest value, and do it that way. I think, though, based on the conversation we've had so far, that we'll probably be able to do a little bit of both. It sounds like we'll be able to follow the approved kind of modeling method and then use sensitivities to figure out, how much benefit is there of relaxing various constraints by using that type of a concept.
Yeah. And I certainly appreciate that. I would just still advocate that whichever methodology is decided, I think that one of the scenarios, or one of the sensitivities, if you will, a variant, whatever we want to call it, needs to be looking at low impedance lines. It's been proven in other parts of the country that that focusing the power rather than just you know, having it go across the entire system has been more valuable in bringing renewables on and more efficient in the cost of you know, of the electrons by the time they get to the load.
It's Liz, I don't know if this is directly relevant, but the process requires the utilities to look at, you know, cost-saving technologies, if that's something that you're thinking about.
Yeah, appreciate that, Liz. I think that should be part of that process as well at the local utility level. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Dave. That was great.
Yeah, thanks, Skylar. Appreciate it.
And next, it looks like we have Jia from NYPA.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So we compared the NYSO, the scenarios they have a lower demand and a higher demand scenarios comparing to the state scenario. And we noticed that the load forecast in the NYSO higher demand is a very significant difference with the state scenario, especially in the winter peak case. In the 2025-2030 timeframe, it's around like a 3 gigawatts difference. However, when it goes to like 2040, it's go to 2035, it's about a 6 gigawatt difference, and go to 2040 is 12 gigawatt differences. The higher demand, the NYSO scenario has a much higher winter peak demand. So, you know, there must be some basis for that. So we think, you know, maybe, you know, we need a higher demand case, you know, at least thinking about the potential, the higher load forecast in the future, especially for the winter peak case, considering the state system gonna go to winter peaking, how the system will look like. So that's the comparison we made, and we like the EPAC team to consider.
Thank you. Yes, that's definitely clear, and multiple people did mention, you know, load forecasts as being clear driving points for generation build out and transmission investment. The big difference in my experience from looking at those load forecasts previously, I think one of the big differences between those forecasts comes down to the breakdown of air source versus ground source heat pump deployment, the type of technology and efficiency of those technologies, and then the amount of managed charging assumed versus unmanaged charging. And so, as you can see, you know, just a few of those assumptions, which are for primarily, you know, behavioral and stock rollover type decisions that are not typically, you know, driven by a capacity expansion model. That's an input. Those are possible futures, and so you know, those are different behavioral outcomes for the load forecast that can really have a huge impact. So I totally understand folks wanting to kind of test those higher potential load forecasts to see how it would drive decision making. And just for others' feedback, I've raised this with other folks and the NYSO in modeling discussions before about trying to figure out, you know, since it's just the load forecast, if that's the only thing that's changing, is that a sensitivity or a scenario? And it really seems like it, since it changes pretty much everything about the build out of the scenario, it's really going to be a scenario, not just a sensitivity. So if we're going to be changing something like the load forecast to be a much higher load forecast, we'd want that to be a central component of it, but we would want to build out the rest of the quote unquote world of that scenario to be compatible with that, so that we're kind of creating an alternate universe to see if there's, you know, anything else that would need to change in reference to that scenario. That probably wouldn't be the only aspect that changes, but it could be consistent with a number of other assumptions as well.
Yeah, sounds makes sense. Thank you. Yeah.
Skylar, this is Tom Vaccaro from National Grid again. Just in the interest of giving you input on these themes, high load feels like one that aligns well with the principle you started us out with, the idea of trying to get to bookends to your point, following on your conversation with NISO, load is probably one of the good ways to drive you towards that bookend as one of the more outcome determinative variables to play with.
Mhm.
Looks like we've got William Gunther from Con Ed next.
Yep, thanks for that. Yeah, my question is about the relationship between the state scenario and two others on your list. The state scenario is based on integration analysis S2, which has the description strategic use of low carbon fuels. Does the state scenario maintain that use of alternative fuels in heating and transportation, as well as the DFIRs that we talked about earlier? And then in terms of the scenarios on your list, how are alternative fuels used in the low DFIR scenario? I assume that's taking the hydrogen out for DFIRs, but keeping other fuels for heating and transportation. And then the high load, where I think you do pick up the electrification, where you've taken out all the alternative fuels and you just have the electrification driving the high load. I'm just curious on your thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah, so for that, the first question about what's in that scenario one, you're right, that scenario load forecast does include the stocks of various alternative and low fuel resources, and uses the combustion of hydrogen, thermal combustion of hydrogen, as the DFIR in that case. So that state scenario in scenario one is consistent with that scenario two in the integration analysis. For your next couple of questions, these scenario proposals have not been fleshed out yet, and so that would be part of the discussions of this meeting and the next meeting of, if we're trying to test alternative scenarios where there are, say, no DFIRs available. What does that mean about the rest of the economy? Should there also be no alternative fuels of any kind available anywhere? Should we move completely away from combustion? There's some combinations of assumptions that might be more convenient for our purposes. And I think this has been brought up before. There's a couple of alternate scenarios in terms of load forecasts that exist both at the NISO and through the integration analysis that looked at those different worlds. For example, the scenario 3 through the integration analysis looks at kind of accelerating away from combustion in all aspects of the economy. So that might, that is one option that would be on the table for that scenario. If we go with something that's a no DFIR scenario, it might also change other aspects of the load forecast by removing alternative fuels from that as well. And hopefully we can, build assumptions that either rely on previous work or are not, too onerous to generate new assumptions, because we do have limited time. If absolutely essential, we might be able to, put some additional effort and time in modeling to figure out what that, alternative, say, load forecast might be. But we didn't want to promise that up front because we are on a limited time frame here.
Thanks.
And I think Aaron from UIU is next.
Thank you. I have two questions, one regarding CREZ and one regarding the load. So let me start with the load first. Skylar, did I hear you say that the ISO views changes in the load via high load or low load more comparable to a scenario versus the sensitivity?
Yes, yeah, that was a conversation we had last week. It said they were saying it's since it does impact the way you have to set up the model, and it changes so much of the modeling, that it typically is kind of to the level of a scenario as opposed to just a sensitivity.
I find that curious because I thought they did a high load on their scenarios that they're proposing as well. So I would be interested in exploring it, and I think that getting back to some of my initial questions, what is deemed a scenario versus a sensitivity from the ISO would be really helpful. And with regards to changes in load, I would imagine if we're changing the load shape, that would be probably very complicated and comparable to a scenario. But if we were just to say it's a higher load or a lower load, that to me seems, it seems a little more straightforward. So I think, you know, yeah, and so I just think we really need to understand that and be able to be prepared. So if somehow you can get the ISO to educate us, I think it could save a lot of time, and so we can focus our conversations. Okay.
Yes, I totally get that. I have that same concern. I did not specify, unfortunately. Now that you've kind of clarified that after this discussion, I kind of wish I had clarified. But my question to them had been, you know, if you're changing the load forecast, if you present basically a different load forecast, is that different as a scenario versus sensitivity? I think you're right. They do in their modeling right now for their policy cases in this the SRO. They actually have 3 scenarios. One is a low demand, one is a high demand, and then one is the state scenario. So I think it's because they do change, like the load profile itself is changing. But I do agree, if it was like just -5% or +10%, that seems like it would be much easier to implement and maybe even easier to run as a sensitivity. But it depends on how, you know, what we're trying to go for and what the inputs would have to be. So I'll follow up with them to see if we can get more information.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. And I'm sorry, I did have one other question regarding zones. So I guess, I don't know if somebody wanted to weigh in on that, the load portion?
Yes, very briefly, Erin, maybe sensitivity is, it's like you just vary that, you know, load while everything else stays the same, is fixed. I think that's how it's being referred, while a full scenario will be like running that expansion tool and the decisions that the model is making, you know, rerunning that. So I think that may be what New York ISO is referring to, sensitivity. Like they keep everything the same, but they just change load. So it's like, it's not a real scenario.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, and oh, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Aaron. This is Bill Acker again. I just when I didn't jump in earlier, Skylar, when you said the high load is a scenario, but it did cause concern in my eyes because, you know, we don't want to be in a situation where you know, we've invested a fortune in transmission distribution system, and a change in load is, you know, it causes very dramatically different decisions than we would have done otherwise. So, you know, when we had talked about with the earlier steering committee on the for the coordinated group planning process, we tried to we talked a few times, tried to push for a 3x3 situation where you actually had, you know, 3 loads, three build outs and crisscross them to have 9 different scenarios. That clearly wasn't taken up, but the idea that we at least have sensitivities around this, so we understand if, you know, if we would have done something dramatically differently, if load is different, is exceptionally valuable. So to the extent we can apply that on each of the scenarios, that would be very, very helpful.
Great.
And so can I just add one more thought on load before I ask the zone question is, one of the things that strikes me, and, you know, really appreciate the NISO's assistance in terms of doing these runs for us. Yet to the extent we as a group think we need a sensitivity that perhaps would be a little more challenging for the ISO to develop it, if there are the consultants or someone who could create the input for that portion of it and just hand over the input format and data to the ISO to run, just to alleviate the need for them to have to do that exogenous type of data crunching to create the input, then perhaps that's an area where we could consider a consultant's assistance to help inform this discussion and analysis.
Yeah, we'll take that back. I'll definitely, look into that.
Yeah, and, you know, sympathetic to the ISO is to check, double check, and triple check. You know, it does take time. It's always easier said than done sometimes with the changes. And the reason why I brought up that load, just to expand on it a little bit, is is the load growth going to be uniform throughout the state? And do you just assume the relative upstate, downstate load stays the same, or is it going to change? And that would give a different result than I think the concerns that were raised in the interzonal transmission representation. And, you know, I could see a benefit of testing that, perhaps. I don't know, I don't have a good idea what it would be, but you can see where a decision, if that load grows dramatically different than what was originally expected, we could be at a risk of investing a lot in transmission and might not otherwise need it. Or vice versa, be too low in some areas. So just a thought. But this does kind of lead into these competitive renewable energy zones. Skylar, I was really glad you asked what it meant. You never heard of it before. So a new acronym, CREZ, starting off Monday with a new acronym. And so I'm just curious, we have the area of concern phase 2 projects that have been approved by the commission. And I'm assuming that that is included in the base case. Am I mistaken?
No, those are in the base case. The approved phase 2 projects are, yep.
So I guess is the idea of these so-called competitive renewable energy zones basically the same thing as what we've already done for the area of concerns, just called something different?
No, Erin, let me address that real quick. CREZ comes out of a program that Texas ran a number of years ago. That's where that acronym originates. The commission was asked in the course of the planning proceedings to consider establishing renewable energy zones along a similar model. And the commission said, no, not at this time. We're not doing that. So call me if you want to get filled in more detail on that, but we don't currently have a program that establishes CREZ-like renewable energy zones.
Okay, and that's helpful. So thank you. I probably will touch base with you just to save everybody else's time. But with regards to the transmission and the marginal intrazonal transmission representation, plus coupled with, which I think will be really valuable for the purposes of this analysis, is the granular supply curves that I believe it's the first time it's ever been kind of incorporated into a resource expansion model in New York. And this is the perfect time to see how a model with perfect foresight that won't be perfect in reality, but closer than probably what we've proposed in the past, that probably was the basis for those specific resource mix in that 2030 and time frame. But you could see the real value of, let's see what is the cheapest way to do this. And I agree, it will be helpful to see the underlying assumptions to see how we should dial those costs up or down in terms of the intrazonal marginal cost, and see where the generation really wants to land up. So I'm supportive of seeing that information, but I'm reluctant to too quickly assume that we need to cite all these resources in very remote areas when it might be cheaper to put it closer to those areas like Raya highlighted, Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo, and so on. So I'm really interested in seeing those results. So thank you.
Maybe if, Liz and Skylar, if you allow me to just say a couple of words on this comment.
Oh yeah, sure.
And the prior comment, yes, thank you. So you can scrap the CREZ if that's too controversial for this discussion. The idea was what Erin just mentioned, that if we have an area with high supply potential, we have the PA analysis. And those areas that we have in mind are Southern Tier, Watertown, North Country, that area. We all know there are a lot of resources in the queue, and phase 2 upgrades are not enough to support the integration of those projects, and the state does need multiple gigawatts of renewables to meet the targets. So the idea is that to the extent the constraints included in the analysis, which we haven't seen yet, are actually limiting the supply of resources, even if there is potential. The idea is to look at relaxing those to see can a combination of transmission, maybe bulk and local, can help take advantage of all that potential, as opposed to, keeping it constrained. And the constraint is that, we haven't seen the value, so maybe the concern is not there, it's not real. But until we see the values, the point is that it could be limiting in a way that you already shaped the solution, as opposed to looking at different potential of solutions, which could be optimizing. It's finding like that optimum mix of generation and transmission. And when we talk, and the analysis today might include a limitation on transmission based on other headroom or based on the marginal upgrade cost, and rather had those questions on what is that marginal upgrade cost.
Right. Yep, understood. We'll get those numbers around and we can review that and make that a topic of conversation at one of the future meetings for sure.
And Skylar, given that Dave also agreed with this scenario, call it renewable energy zone or relaxing, or looking at relaxing constraints, I think it's should be added to your list here, because you have at least 2 entities supporting this sensitivity or scenario, given we haven't decided what those different teams will be, sensitivity or scenario.
Right. So it sounds like it's more like a preemptive relaxing of the headroom constraints. Is that how we should phrase it? Because it's not really, just looking at the supply curve and, adding transmission where there's a lot of renewables. It's more seeing if there is constraints around like very low cost renewables, and then selecting places to relieve those constraints.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Skylar on the phone.
Jalila, who was next?
Who's next?
We have Raya.
Hi, yeah, I've got a couple quick questions. One, are the models tracking disadvantaged communities by NISO zone?
Did you say that again? Are they doing what?
Tracking disadvantaged communities by zone, by NISO zone that serves them.
I believe that information would be, if we don't already have that on a spreadsheet somewhere, I'm sure it'd be pretty easy to find based on their, the
Okay.
GIS locations that we have. Yeah.
Wait, only I just mentioned because, when we talked about the DACs and the things that will be, that the modeling that will be pertaining to them, there are things that are in the integration analysis, that's true. And then the CLCPA is very specific about what the commission should do in its programs. And as you likely know, one of them is, specify a minimum percentage of energy storage projects should deliver clean energy benefits into NISO zones that serve disadvantaged communities. So that is one requirement, but I'm just offering or asking that for sure we look at disadvantaged communities by NISO zone. It's required by the CLCPA, but it's also, I think, a good suggestion. One thing that can help us, get around this question of substantial benefits that the CLCPA wants the commission to do. So is that something that we can sort of make sure is elevated in what we're tracking in the modeling?
Ryan, it's Liz. Maybe we need to talk about this offline. I think we're kind of mixing apples and oranges here. This is not the commission's plan. This is the JU's plan. The commission's going to act much later. And I know there's certain things we certainly want to show, we want the modeling to be compliant with the things it needs to be compliant with, and to highlight the issues that are, capable of being highlighted in this kind of modeling exercise. So the commission has the benefit of those when the commission is faced with making a decision. But I think we're a little bit, I think we should have a sidebar on this.
All right, I'm happy to have a sidebar, but I'm just, we know that we're going to have to model by law the shuttering of New York City's peakers, because that's, of the NYPA-owned peakers. So that's part of this. And, part of that piece is, in terms of the CLCPA, why, it's like, well, you need to make sure that there's a minimum amount of storage that is in the zone served by disadvantaged communities. And it doesn't sound like a big ask to be tracking which NISO zones have disadvantaged communities. So, I mean, I'm happy to sidebar, but I think that it sounds like it would be a helpful thing to do now for the purpose of this modeling, so that the commission can make decisions about disadvantaged communities that they're going to be faced with. So so I'm just highly suggesting that you look at where the DACs within the NISO zones, as the CLCPA is indicating, is a good technique. The next question I had was about what some folks were speaking about before. We talked about being able to have access to some of the some of the modeling parameters or the tools that are being used, and other assumptions, because in order for us, speaking of oranges and apples, in order for us to understand what scenario 2 and what scenario 3 will have, we kind of need to get our arms around what this scenario 1 is, so we know what we're comparing it to. So I guess the second question is, when can we expect to have more information about the tools and or the modeling for scenario 1?
So we tried to spend, a good chunk of the first 3 meetings going over scenario 1. I know we haven't submitted every assumption or every spreadsheet that has gone into that that development yet. We're still waiting on some feedback on what we're going to be able to share in terms of the supply curve and a couple of other input documents or spreadsheets, but we've gone over scenario 1 to the extent that we were planning on it in this process. If you have other questions on what went into scenario 1 or anything, I'm happy to have a separate call to go through any other questions you have on scenario 1. We have uploaded to the EPAC website 4 or 5 additional documents that provide things like the capacity curves and the load forecast and a few other things. And then there's links in the matrix itself to some of the spreadsheets and input documents from the integration analysis that we're using. So if there's other resources that you're looking for, or questions about the ones that already exist, happy to have a call about those.
Okay, and it sounds like, will we have access to the tool? This is something we talked about in a prior meeting, the tool that's been developed?
The supply curve tool?
I believe that was the tool. I know we, 2 meetings ago, you talked about the development of a tool you were using to do this modeling, and I know I had asked if we would have access to it. So I'll have to go back and check to see the exact name.
It's probably the supply curve tool, because we did have a presentation on that 2 meetings ago about kind of how the resources were deemed available and how they were costed out. That's just one of the inputs to the capacity expansion modeling. Beyond those, I can't think of any other tool that we're going to really be able to have access to. But yeah, the supply curve analysis, we're hoping at some point we'll be able to have a final version of that to post to our website.
So Skylar, this is John Verdiker with NYSERDA again. So we got to be careful about the use of the word tool at times. So we're preparing to provide to EPAC the information we provided to the NISO for input into the models for scenario 1. But a conversation on whether or not some would have access to the full background tool and all the associated GIS files, et cetera, is not something that we've committed to at this point.
No, no. No, the
Wanna be
discussion was
really
only
clear
for
on
the
that.
input. Yeah,
Yes,
right.
we're gonna provide folks with the inputs that we provided to the NISO so that they can look at those and review them. I just want to be really clear because when someone says tool, they may be thinking something more than that.
All right. And when do you think we'll be able to see those?
So I can't commit on an exact date right now. We're working to get it posted on NYSERDA's website and then be able to provide a link to DPS staff to be able to link it directly to the EPAC website. And I imagine the group would be updated at that point.
Thank you so very much. And then the last thing I'll say, so thank you very much for that. I mean, I guess, and we can talk about it another call, but is it possible to track can we make sure that we're looking at NISO zones where there's a prevalence of disadvantaged communities?
Yes, we're going to be looking at that.
Okay.
Definitely. I mean, all these scenarios are planning to be compliant with what's in the CLCPA. If there's anything more specific than that you have in mind.
Hey, Skylar, can I ask a question? Aren't there disadvantaged communities in every NICA zone? I mean, each NICA zone is comprised of half a dozen counties,
Right.
at least.
Right, which is, yeah, and this capacity expansion model is by zone. It's not looking granular, so it's more of a later stage question. But it's obviously something that may have impacts as we move into, say, the stage 5 modeling, and we will be tracking CLCPA impacts all the way through this process.
All right. Thank you.
And it looks like we've got Tim McClive next.
Yeah, I just, I'm Tim McClive, Central Hudson. I want to go back to a topic of, excuse me, 10 or 15 minutes ago and try to disabuse anyone of the notion that the CREZ model would work in New York. The background of CREZ is that West Texas is one of the premier unparalleled resource areas for wind. It's also undeveloped, with the exception of a couple cities and a lot of ranches. But what CREZ did was allow wind developers to come in and put in 200, 500, 700 megawatt wind farms and allowed the utilities, gave the utilities basically a free hand to build as much transmission as necessary, which meant stringing up probably hundreds or even thousands of miles of new 230 and 345 kV line across undeveloped desert land. I don't think that New York has anything like the geography of Texas, which would support that kind of model.
Certainly, it's certainly stunningly different from a land use perspective at the very least.
Thank you for that background.
Is there any more hands? I do want to move
Maybe
to the
just
closing.
maybe just on that comment, and again, I said we can drop the CREZ idea given it's causing heartburn in this discussion. The idea wasn't like CREZ far away renewable zones, was simply if you have an area that has a lot of renewable potential, do we just fix every local segment, or is there an opportunity for a 230 kV, 345 kV line and other type of technologies that can support more renewable integration for similar amount of investment costs or less? So that's the simple idea of just allowing for that evaluation to happen. And again, based on the fact that we don't have access to what is being used today.
Yeah, and so this is Dave Rupert. I'd just throw in that I don't think anybody on the call is saying that Texas is like New York. I can list 10 different things of why the states aren't the same. So that's not it. It's more of optimizing where you can put the renewables to make the most efficient use of transmission systems. Building 750 megawatt farms isn't going to happen in New York. It's not a desert. By the way, New York, New York has 230 and 345. Texas does not. That's all 345. So there's the idea is optimizing versus sub-optimizing that appears to be occurring at this time.
Thanks, Dave. Okay. I want to move to maybe if there's any final questions.
I was just going to note that Adamir had his hand up as well.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, hi, Skylar. This is Idemir. Just a quick, I'm with Con Edison. Just wanted to try to focus the scenario discussion. I think it's been
Thank
said,
you.
Tom Vaccaro came out and said it earlier from National Grid. Based on the themes I see here, and I think a couple of the things that Aaron pointed out, the fact that how the load grows to achieve CLCPA goals, how the ratio of upstate to downstate load varies. A lot of thought goes into developing those inputs, and the high electrification scenario from the Climate Action Council that I think NYSERDA worked on is, in my opinion, a prime candidate for exploration as one of the scenarios, because all of that, all of the load growth is based on econometric factors and assumptions surrounding where and how much electrification is assumed. And it's kind of a very carefully thought out scenario. And if you're talking about, what the definition of a scenario versus sensitivity is, for an actual scenario, we need that level of thought. So that's just my last minute addition here.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I wanted to use these last 10 minutes for. So thanks for kind of focusing us on that. I think Bill may have raised this earlier too, that having a high flexibility scenario or a low transmission build out scenario is very similar to what you would see in a high DER or high local focus scenario. So those could almost be combined with whatever additional, either the base case, load forecast or a new load forecast to create a scenario. And I don't want to stretch it too far, but there's a chance that if we're trying to focus on high local solutions and community-based solutions, it might also blend with the low hydrogen availability or low DEFR scenario as well. So there's some considerations here about we might be able to be testing a lot of things in these given scenarios. In this alternative world we could be building by testing a few of these things at the same time. And I like what Idemir just said about the high load scenario. That is an alternative world, and if we do end up using something like, say, a alternative scenario that's already been developed through the Climate Action Council, that was built from the ground up, all the way from stock rollovers and residential end uses and all that good stuff, that could serve as the basis of creating an additional scenario as well, with or without a few of these other scenarios. So just wanted to, if anybody had quick thoughts about whether these top three could actually be combined as a single scenario, or if this low to min DEFR scenario should be, say, a sensitivity off the base case or its own standalone scenario.
Skylar, it's Jeff Marr from National Grid. I mean, I guess the DEFR question feels a little bit different than the other two. DEFRs, from everything that we're seeing, DEFRs are going to be critical to maintaining the reliability of the system. But we might be able to throttle the amount of DEFRs depending on some other assumptions we make in the model. So I kind of see that as a separate one. Like, even if there was a high load build out, you still might be able to minimize DEFRs by playing with some of the other levels. or other levers in the model, but yeah, so I see DFIRS as separate.
And if I could add to that real quick, we should think about DFIRS as a placeholder, not necessarily hydrogen burning units, but they are very helpful in helping us identify what operating characteristics are needed as we get closer to 2040 to balance the system with a lot of intermittency. Not necessarily that those operational requirements have to be served by a hydrogen burning unit, but we do need to understand those needs.
Right, right. And we'll be doing a lot of modeling to hopefully understand that through the various NISO modeling and the initial scenario one. I think what I read in a lot of the scenario proposals though was, the uncertainty of the technology, the uncertainty of that cost, and whether, there's a way to test alternative solutions, whether it's, fuel cells or flexibility or high DERs or local demand response or something like that. Just trying to figure out a way, like what does the alternative look like, and is it possible to minimize or eliminate the majority of those resources? And so it's still something folks need to test, even though you're right, through the gaps analysis and through this state scenario one, we will be seeing, the value, the services that the model is seeing those resources provide.
Yeah, comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Dave Clark from LIPA. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, I would see that to the extent that there's a relationship between DFIRS and transmission. So to the extent that you have diversity of load, you have diversity of output for renewables, that, that if you are unable to meet DFIRS, you need to have more transmission and vice versa. So I see these really falling along the lines, since our major decision variable is how much transmission, bulk and local do we need? It seems to me that a high bulk and local transmission need scenario makes sense, and we think about all those things that would contribute to that, constraints limiting renewables, higher remote load growth, things along those lines, and kind of try to identify those things that would contribute to a higher bulk and local transmission need. And we have the base need that's from the case that you guys have already articulated, and then a case that might have a lower bulk and local transmission need. And what are the combination of factors that lead to that? And the idea being that that's really what we're studying. What are the factors that would drive a larger transmission solution, and what are the factors that would drive a smaller transmission solution? So from my perspective, that seems to be the axis we should be thinking about from a scenario perspective. But I would put DFIRS in the category of contributing to a higher, the lack of DFIRS would contribute to a higher transmission need.
Right. I think that is probably a good way to look at it. That these are, high versus low, just transmission needs, and how these might actually, result in the different transmission build outs. So it's you're right. We wouldn't necessarily want to be blending something that really pushes down the transmission need, blending it with something that has a high transmission need, because then we're not actually testing the boundaries of what we're trying to learn. So I know we only have we only have 2 minutes. I think we got a lot of really good input on what people are thinking, and how many people have different feedback on these types of top themes. I don't think the themes have changed much, or the support for the themes has changed much, except for maybe increasing the importance for a handful of folks wanting to look at ways to maybe build in sensitivities, at least the sensitivity off the base case, maybe even a way to test it in each of the scenarios of like how to relax the backbone of the system, or relax certain constraints to make to unmodel renewables preemptively, to see how that impacts the outputs. So that's another thing to consider here. But I think one of the takeaways we want to have here is that we need to find the difference between a sensitivity and a scenario, how many sensitivities we'll be able to work with, and then figure out which one of these needs to be built out into its own scenario. I don't necessarily want to wait the full 2 weeks before we see any of these developed into their own scenario. So I personally would like to maybe have the JU take as the next steps in the process, and you know, let me know what you think about this. But building maybe 2 or 3 scenario themes, like scenario matrices, based off of the first scenario matrix, that combine, you know, use or combine these to test, you know, high transmission build outs or low transmission build outs, and not necessarily fill in all these assumptions, but find a way to work in these top themes. And I'll send this around so you don't have to take a screenshot or guess or whatever. Build in these themes to build 2 or 3 additional scenarios so that you can bring them back to our next meeting and we can talk through what it actually looks like to have a scenario, moving beyond the themes that we see here to what does it look like as a scenario and what does it test. Now that we've heard some feedback here, is that something from someone from the JU can give me a thumbs up that that's possible? Maybe 2 or 3 scenario matrices to react to.
This is Jeff Marr from National Grid. You're saying you'd like to discuss that in 2 weeks with meeting materials posted in advance, or is that the ask?
At least maybe posting the 2 or 3 scenario matrices a day or 2 before the meeting. But the meeting itself would be to discuss the materials. So the pre-review isn't 100% necessary since we've had this discussion today, but within the next 2 weeks, just coming up with the title and scenario blend of what potential scenarios mixing these themes would be, and just highlighting, not even necessarily filling out the matrix, but highlighting which assumptions would likely need to be altered from the first scenario to create these scenarios.
2 weeks to do kind of the outline of 2 scenarios is going to be fairly difficult. I think we had started, you know, crafting the second scenario. The third scenario is a little more open in our minds. So I guess I can say we'll do our best, but that's kind of a tall ask at this point. You know, the JU is a big group of people. It's sometimes difficult to get all of us on the same page in kind of that short amount of time. So probably at least one of the scenarios we could come back with kind of the sketch for the first one in 2 weeks. The third one will be a stretch.
Sounds good. Yeah, even if it's lacking in ultimate detail about what the full scenario is, if there's something that we come back to, like, okay, this is the scenario that's testing more of a high transmission need build out. It has XYZ as a change and incorporates these themes that stakeholders thought were important. Like, even if it's to that level that we can react to and start building it out, that'd be great.
Okay, we'll set that as a target for 2 weeks from now.
Okay, I know we kept folks a couple minutes ahead, past time, but I really appreciate all the discussion today. I think we made great headway and moving on to next steps. So I appreciate everyone's feedback today. And if there's no other clarifying questions to end, I think we'll wrap up right here.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everybody. Thanks, everybody. Yep.
That's all.
Yeah.
Have a good one. Thanks, bye.